and welcome back to Sustainable AF. In this first series, we're taking you on a guided tour of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, a framework designed to help us build a more sustainable future.
I'm Alex. I'm an ex-finance guy who is now focused on a regenerative agriculture startup.
I'm Felicia, an author and entrepreneur now teaching climate change, energy transition and sustainable finance at SOAS, the University of London. This week, we're going to be talking about SDG 17, which is actually about partnerships for the goals. This final SDG is about the focus and funding that's going to any and all of the goals to be achieved. It's about the need for cross-sector and cross-border collaboration, about global policy alignment, and if we take it to its logical conclusion, the need to reimagine finance and its purpose.
Put simply, it's about strengthening and streamlining cooperation between nation states, both developed and developing, using the SDGs as a shared framework and a shared vision for defining that collaborative way forward. Focus and funding for the SDGs is heavily weighted towards more well-known global issues like ending hunger, that's SDG 2, and achieving quality education for all, that's SDG 4. But for one to be achieved, they kind of all need to work together. It's looking at that systems-based approach.
So to date, from technology to finance and to the allocation of resources, there's been a really slow progress. When we check up on how close we are to achieving the goals, the vast majority of countries fall short of where they were hoping to be. That's obviously been exacerbated by COVID, as it's changed the urgency of action in politicians' minds. In many ways, in fact, the private sector seems to be moving faster than the public.
Absolutely. The problem is that as long as this continues to be the case, the prospects of achieving the other 16 goals will remain very difficult, if not utterly unachievable. The point about partnerships for the goals is that it's about talking about different ways of working together or finding new ways to partner that will help reflect the responsibilities and impact that different economies have had over time in terms of the position we're in. And namely, this is where lots of dangerous warming has already taken place.
The climate actually is a brilliant example of where the problem is. In terms of emissions and its impact on the global temperature, where we are today is going to be baked in for the next few hundred years. Yet we know we need to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. The latest numbers suggest we might actually have increased emissions from 2010 levels by 16%. That's going to mean more extreme weather, more changes, more systemic challenges. Like all the other systemic problems, we need to address this today. The way that we've been doing things hasn't been working, and we need to find a new way.
And of course, like a lot of situations in life, it all comes down to money. What happens in a lot of these partnerships is asking some of the world's richest countries to shoulder more of the responsibility for funding and supporting sustainable development, which can mean everything and anything from debt relief to climate, to funding climate tech and adaptation, to designing and implementing policy coherently.
So as Alex has said, it's really truly about systemic change. If we're to disrupt the cycles at work that have made the SDGs necessary, it's also going to be necessary to disrupt the ways in which we work together to achieve that systemic change we want, because the SDGs have got to work together with each other and in balance.
The goal has targets that are grouped together. They're in categories covering finance, technology, capacity building and trade. And then there's a group which covers systemic issues, which means things like trying to build multi-stakeholder partnerships and ensuring that information gaps are filled. Now that means data, monitoring and accountability. And in the end, it's about achieving policy and institutional coherence. Each of these has its own set of sub-targets. But today we're going to talk about why each of these matter and the role they have to play in achieving the overall goals as well.
So no surprise, we're going to start with finance. One of the things we need to be clear about is what is good versus bad. And by that, we mean, good meaning effective and moving us towards the goals. This is not about making value judgments. One of the reasons we talk about finance first is that finance and economics are fundamental to society, as the economy exists within a social and environmental ecosystem. It's dependent on workers and consumers and clean air and water and health and education. What's even more interesting is it's even been argued that finance and economics are how we express our values in society.
The thing about finance is that it can be the driver for change or the anchor that restricts change. Global economic forces and the free market have different agendas, meaning that sometimes the right investments or the morally, ethically, environmental investment gets left by the wayside in favor for something that is perceived as something that's more lucrative, i.e. oil companies, weapons manufacturers, or companies that run a high profit margin but basically don't care about their employees or the environment. Luckily, in recent times, the tide is starting to change.
Now, we've talked a lot on this podcast. About how capital can be put to good use. The tide of ESG investments is flooding the market on the back of investor demand. And the rise of fintech has meant that finance is actually being made available more freely all over the world to people who just wouldn't be able to access it before. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The rise in impact investing is important. Ethical finance and stakeholder capitalism is now beginning to have an impact on the market overall.
Yeah, absolutely. You're seeing these buzzwords in the likes of the Financial Times. So this is not just some lefty out there thing. This is actually happening. Today, the EU has its own sustainable finance platform, and both the US and Europe are exploring the idea of building back better, recovering from the impact of the pandemic by investing in greener, cleaner technologies and industries. While a lot of recovery funds have actually been spent on supporting the status quo, like fossil fuel subsidies, airline subsidies, that want to support without having to commit emissions cuts, there's a real opportunity here to look at value differently, to look at externalities and co-benefits from the negative impact of carbon emissions to the positive benefits of clean air and water, and change the way we look at risk and return in finance.
But obviously, tools are going to be needed to make this work. And that can mean anything from reporting standards to transparency, to political frameworks and regulations, to mechanisms that can help investors understand how they need to change. In the EU, Alex mentioned the Sustainable Finance Platform, there's actually a taxonomy that's been developed to help investors and companies easily identify what is a positive and sustainable investment.
Now, there's obviously still a lot of work to do. The ESG investment lens, or an approach where investors look at the environmental, social, and governance behaviours of companies, has the potential to shift investment as investors support positive action. While ESG is hitting a lot of backlash in the media today, a lot of fundamentals of ESG are becoming basic hygiene issues for the functioning company. And that's a really positive thing.
Part of the problem, though, is that there's still a disconnect between what fund managers, ESG ratings companies, investors seem to expect. Often today, the information available is rarely reliable. The methodologies used to calculate it are often private and unclear. And actually, the approach is both opaque and backward-looking. It's all about what's happened in the past. But there's still huge opportunities here. The world in which we operate is changing, and companies that support those changes could be really successful.
Absolutely. If you look at the direction of travel for positive investments, we're definitely going in the right way. But like anything new, it needs a bit of brush and polish. New business models and economic principles are becoming more salient, namely regenerative economics, framing investment decisions around the need for people, planet, profit. Not only sounds like a good idea, but it forms the basis of new regenerative approaches where the focus is on healing planetary, society, and economic systems that have been subjected to abuse in their current form. It sounds a bit ethereal, but it's possible. And the best thing about it is there's great opportunity to actually build back better than sticking with the status quo. Even companies like Pepsi have seen the benefits, and they've just announced plans to regenerate 7 million acres of land, equivalent to the land affected by their operations. And if they can do it, many other huge global conglomerates can.
And they are. You know, a lot of what we're talking about here If it's going to move beyond company promises and the idea of doing less ill, is that what we've got to do is change the way in which we ascribe value. We've talked about this before. Value has historically been defined as financial return over a short period of time. But if we start looking at the cost of operations in terms of natural capital, what it costs you to operate, if we price in externalities and if we tax those externalities, that could completely change the way in which finance engages with the environment, with society, and with its own concepts of governance. And the exciting thing is we are already seeing this play out.
Policy is driving change. Policy is driving change. And government concern is driving comprehensive reports like the Dasgupta Review on the economics of biodiversity, which shows the finance world how working with nature is worth more than working against it. For an example, the UK timber market is said to be worth £112 million a year. However, when you include natural capital and externalities like carbon sequestration and biodiversity credits, you could make that market worth as much as 12 billion.
That said, we're still a very, very long way from where we need to be. Questions need to be asked about the speed of transition. And as always, who and how are we going to pay for sustainable development? Rich countries are rich because of what they've done historically. Massive economic development with little regard for the environment means it is by nature unsustainable. Many poorer countries are now at the mercy of climate change that they had very little involvement in creating. So there are huge issues to be resolved around equity, justice, and responsibility.
The critical question that is posed in various forums about the SDGs invariably ends with the question, well, who is going to fund the change that we want to see? Where will the money come from? How can low and middle income countries generate sufficient resources to finance the 2030 development agenda? How can we afford it? As well as, although each country has its own priorities, paying the bills for the SDGs remains a delicate matter. The Asia-European Foundation calculated that the total investment costs to achieve the SDGs by 2030 are between $5 to $7 trillion per year at a global level, between a total of 3.3 and 4.5 trillion per year in developing countries.
Now, the thing is, there are lots of different estimates and lots of different big numbers floating around. But at the very least, most people expect an average investment need of at least 2.5 trillion a year in developing countries to reach the goals. Yet today, countries are cutting their overseas development finance. They're not living up to their commitments on climate finance. How on earth are we then supposed to find what seems like an insurmountable sum? Yet during COVID, there was a report from the Washington-based Institute of Policy Studies that showed US billionaires grew their wealth by $1 trillion between March and November 2020. So a small group of people grew their individual wealth by $1 trillion, and we just need 2.5 trillion a year. The potential in the market is there. What if we could redirect these existing trillions to a healthier, better future? What we need to think about is how we redirect financial flows away from negative and unsustainable investments towards those that provide a multitude of other benefits, be they climate, environmental, biodiversity, health, or any other.
The important thing is they're benefits, not negatives. And there are lots of ways that this could be achieved. And it's all about redirecting capital, not necessarily finding new money. Recently, investors with $46 trillion under management, that's a lot of money. About 40% of global assets called for tougher climate commitments to end fossil fuel subsidies, phasing out of coal, and support a Build Back Better program. This kind of policy commitment could really result in change.
And this is the kind of thing that, investors are calling on politicians for, activist groups are calling on politicians for. But there are other ways as well, through trade and even remittances. So remittances is something people often forget, let alone the grey economy, which exists in almost every country. Remittances actually have the potential to become a really important tool for poverty reduction and increased resilience, both for families and for entire communities. There's even companies that set up to formalize this. Sending money home to families is one thing, which allows the international diaspora in any country to send money home. But there are also companies like Simplify, where you can actually loan money on really, really simple terms to local farmers in order to help them grow. And I think it's worth actually paying attention to the fact that in Nigeria alone, in 2020, the diaspora accounted for nearly $17 billion of funds that flowed back to the country. If you could get those in the right direction, you could completely transform the economy.
Totally. And that brings us on to our next subtopic, and that's trade. International financial flows, whether through remittances or trade, are going to make a real difference with this target. What are you funding? What are you trading? Are you focused on exploration of resources or looking to build a greener economy? Trade is going to play a hugely important role in helping emerging economies grow in green and innovative ways. But that's easier said than done. It's not going to be that simple.
Yeah, because the problem is that trade liberalization, which is often what is seen as a big driver of trade, and globalization, which connects all the different countries together, can have both positive and negative effects on development. And they've got to be understood. This is the part about the SDGs, which is about understanding trade-offs. Historically, the global north has outsourced a lot of its manufacturing to countries which have ended up with negative environmental and climate consequences. There was a report a few years ago which showed that a third of the UK's carbon emissions were actually generated in China, and being a third of the emissions generated by things consumed in the UK.
Yeah.
But these approaches can only really work if they're integrated with other goals around decent work and environmental protection. So we need to deal with trade, but we need to do it in the right way.
A green focus can help to support technology innovations across the board. In solar, for example, look beyond the use of solar, beyond producing electricity, e.g. solar powered cars, solar for cooking and heating, building integrated PV and solar into hydrogen, taking that systems-based approach again and the trade-offs that has.
And every country's got different capacities. And the important thing is to find out what to develop. Where should you put your green growth funds? It's much easier for countries to develop competitiveness in products that require similar skills, equipment, and know-how to an existing skills base. In Germany, for example, much of the early solar industry was built on the back of local experience in semiconductors.
There is research that shows huge opportunities for new industries in new markets. Trade can create jobs, raise incomes, and by doing so, enhance the welfare of people. But that doesn't mean just looking for the cheapest solution or working in areas where environmental protections are weak or where children are in the workforce due to overwhelming poverty. This is about system change.
And the reason we keep reiterating that is because, like other things that we're discussing, trade doesn't happen in a vacuum. Some countries and some companies have a lot more power than others. One of the partnership targets is about the importance of promoting a universal and rules-based, open and non-discriminatory, and most importantly, equitable multilateral trading system. We've got the World Trade Organization, and we're still waiting for the conclusion of Doha negotiations. But what it boils down to is, if we're going to get to where we need to be, we need to have a level playing field.
We've already talked before about how innovation and technology can be so transformational, from mobile banking and water payments to new ways of assessing and enabling credit, to allowing people to access the mechanism for growth and learning. Technology is so important to the transition to a zero carbon world, and therefore plays an important part in the partnership for the goals at every level.
So, for example, at a larger scale, technological advancements in renewable energy has led to huge gains in electricity efficiency and a massive build out in renewable energy and smart grids. EVs are another example where technology has meant that zero carbon transport is possible. What matters here is how that technology is implemented and transferred. if it's owned by the global north and costs a fortune in the global south, who's actually benefiting?
This is a classic concern that has encapsulated the story of Monsanto. This is a classical concern that is encapsulated in the story of Monsanto. It created seeds resilient to its own herbicides, but patented the seeds and insisted that any seeds resulting from those crops belong to it. So instead of having seed cycles, farmers have to now pay every year for new seeds. You could argue that Monsanto built itself a sustainable revenue stream, but no one can argue that this is sustainable behaviour in terms of the wealth of poor farmers.
So there's no doubt that technology can change lives, from solar-powered lights in medical clinics and homes for schooling, to phone-based microfinance enabling economic growth, to breakthroughs in medicines like the vaccines. Innovation is going to be key to driving sustainable development and a zero-carbon pathway. But this is the point that Alex is making. It's not just about technological innovation.
Yeah, totally, Fee. It's financial innovation. It's policy innovation. It's process innovation, that we can start looking at the circulation of economy, for example. Siemens have just announced the world's first fully recyclable wind turbine, which is a huge leap forward for that sector.
But you see, this all brings us to capacity building, because one of the big questions is, what is it that you're good at? What is it that you have a strength in? And capacity building and understanding what that capacity is a fundamental part of the partnership goals. Officially, it's about enhancing international support for implementing effective and targeted capacity building in developing countries to support national plans to implement all the sustainable development goals. Whatever that's supposed to mean.
Yeah, that's a hell of a mouthful, and I basically went to sleep as soon as you started saying it. But it's about building different countries' capacities in engaging within the frameworks, the goals, and the targets. That is the money, time, skills, and people. There is so much that goes into capacity.
And that means thinking about domestic financial systems. Are there the skills and governance and robust legal frameworks to ensure that funds go to the right places and are used in the right way? Or to ensure that local people are effectively involved in working out local solutions?
One of the things is about promoting the integration of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs into national sustainable development planning frameworks, shared lessons learned and good practices throughout workshops and related events. People have to talk to one another on every level of the scale. That's all well and good, but what about the commercial banking system or the robustness of long-term investment mechanisms like pensions? Or how about just access to financial services in many countries? What are the legal ownership systems like? What are the educational systems like? Even what are the cultural systems like?
Yeah, because if you think about the arguments that are taking place today in some of the most developed markets, especially in terms of externalities of ecosystem services and natural capital, we need to think about worldviews. We need to think about the educational system and how economics, business, and finance are taught. If it's still stuck in short-term neoliberal paradigms, how are we expected to change anything? If some kind of value isn't put on the use of land and air and water, economists are just going to stick with that never-ending bias that suggests that short-term costs to clean things up are too expensive in the long run. And this happens because economists often discount the value of things in the future, imagining that all of our problems are going to be sorted by some magic bullet in the interim.
There is a history of distrust between developed and developing countries, often based on concerns about corruption or control. Whatever it is, there are clearly many international consultants involved in this process. Within the large global institutions, people often get moved around, and there isn't necessarily a continuity of knowledge and care about different projects and approaches. And that makes good partnerships so important.
So naturally, SDG 17 includes a focus on the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And all that means is to get everyone together. You can't just have a decision being made by one group of people for another, but that actually all voices have got to be heard, and more importantly, listened to, and their thoughts integrated into plans for action. This is about saying all hands on deck. Everyone is going to be needed if we're going to get anything done and get good things done. There's even a partnerships platform to highlight all the different ways of working together.
When world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, they created a need for everyone to come together. And we haven't really done that much before as a world. Governments, civil society, scientists, academia, the private sector, everyone has to be involved to make this work. This is a great way of mobilizing and sharing knowledge and expertise, technology, and financial resources across all of these different fields to achieve the goal, which is sustainable development for all countries as fast as we bloody can.
Yeah, and these are all coming together in different ways. In the private sector, you've got all the growth in ESG, you've got the focus on impact, you've got concern about climate risk. But I mentioned the UN's platform. It's about learning, it's about interfaces, and it's about making connections. And there are lots of different approaches and commitments, from the Ocean Conference, the Conscious Fashion and Lifestyle Network, the Urban Agenda Platform, the Small Islands Developing States Partnerships, new fisheries governance models. Do you remember we talked about this in Life Below Water?
Yeah, absolutely.
New ideas coming out from people working together in different ways.
And as we've touched on, technology has a massive role to play here too. One that's been ever more important during the pandemic, when everyone's been locked inside and had to be on their piece of technology to create partnerships. But it has created good partnerships through this paradigm shift of going to technology, which just happens to be a more low carbon option than driving into offices for meetings, which is nice. But just as many people don't have access to clean water, social justice, or good jobs. So this basically means the digital divide gets bigger and persists. How do we bridge that gap? How do we change that? The internet's global penetration is still under 60%, leaving billions of people who are unable to access these benefits.
So that means that even aside from sort of mobilizing finance in new ways, we need to create new assets in technology as well as capacity building. So in order to do this, these multi-stakeholder partnerships are going to be crucial, because they're going to be the ones leveraging the links between the different SDGs to make sure they're as effective as they can be and to accelerate progress. But as it stands, we have to ensure that resources are effectively used.
At a country by country level, regular process reviews will be needed, definitely involving civil society, but also businesses and different interest groups. At a regional and global level, countries must share their experience so that common issue can easily be tackled. And that brings us to a very, very important part, and that is
data. Knowing what's going on is fundamental to decision making. The official line is that data allows governments to make evidence-based decisions and citizens to hold governments to account. In short, good public policy requires good data. But what it means is it's important to understand where there's been progress or lack of it, and why, and where further action is needed. We can't see what we need to change if we don't know what reality is on the ground. The famous line used so many times, I've forgotten who said it first, is you can't manage what you can't measure.
Absolutely. Data is basically the eyes and ears of the decision makers, maximizing the efficiency and efficacy of invention and bringing us closer to achieving the SDGs. According to the available evidence, we are not on track to meet most of the SDG targets, which suggests that the measures taken so far by governments and the international community have just not been enough.
But part of the problem is we don't actually know which of the measures they take work and which ones don't, which ones have the most impact and which ones don't. The key problem has been this limited availability and use of relevant data. We may have an increasing amount of sensor data and deal data in the developed world, but even here it's far less robust than we'd like it to be. And the lack of it in the developing world is critical. Fundamentally, data is needed to identify the most pressing constraints and problems and design targeted interventions that can really make a difference.
There's data needed to tell us which groups of people or areas of the country to focus on. Questions such as, which population group is facing the most severe constraints from accessing food? Or who lives in a geographical location which is most likely to be negatively affected by climate change? What are the key factors underlying the inability of individuals or households to access food? These sort of questions are basic, but they can only be answered with appropriate data.
And this is the case throughout the entire process. It's not just identifying what the problem is, but it's identifying where in that system the critical intervention points are. But it's also needed to guide action throughout an entire policy or program. You need to know the beginning and the end and the middle and the impact. Data helps us actually work out what's appropriate in terms of funding. It's the sort of thing that can enable us to change direction when something's gone off course. And it helps us build an understanding that can guide future interventions based on what happened last time.
Data users also need to help us in making sense of the overwhelming volume of data and information that they are presented with each day. This can be accomplished by increasing collaboration across sectors and enhancing users' skills. In addition, policymakers and the public in general must improve their data literacy. Yet more capacity building. But this should be taught in schools from day dot.
Absolutely.
There's so many young parents sitting with their children on iPads at dinner, and that gets boo-hooed. But actual data literacy needs to be taught in schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, part of the problem is, of course, I talked about the fact we haven't got much data. What I mean is much useful data that people can understand. There's data everywhere. We're drowning in it. But so this capacity to manage data, sort of data visualization and storytelling, is so important because it actually helps people understand the meaning of this data. It enables them to understand and communicate patterns and interrelationships in the sheer amount of data and statistics that are actually available to us. So what we need to do is build relationships between statistical offices and open source frameworks and crowdsourced data sets and AI analysis. And as you say, data literacy in the population, data literacy in schools.
Investing in better data is critical to ensuring that scarce humanitarian relief and development resources are put to good use. Innovation in data is happening through a broad range of public and private actors in many parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, and Latin America, especially in the collection and analysis of data for disaster risk management and data on climate change. But we do not need governance of these new data sets. New methodologies need to be developed to ensure the quality and reliability of such data. We almost need a homogenization of climate methodologies so everyone understands what this metric looks like when it comes out of the Indonesian rainforest, the DRC rainforest, or the Bolivian Amazon.
I mean, there will always be differences because of local context, but this is where actually something we've talked about a couple of times so far comes into play, this idea of policy and institutional coherence. We have to be able to be singing from the same song sheet. Governance is what brings us around to this key that brings us around to this idea that we need to take actions that reinforce each other. We need to make sure that we can understand from one situation to another what is actually going on and what the trade-offs are going to be. So, for example, we know that you can actually look at building sustainable agricultural practices for zero hunger, but that's going to be essential to support water efficiency targets and clean water for all, especially as agriculture is the major user of water for about 70% of water withdrawals.
Absolutely. In the same way, we need to avoid the risk of making progress in one goal at the expense of another. For example, an increase in agricultural land use to achieve zero hunger, SDG 2, could undermine the efforts in halting biodiversity loss and preserving terrestrial ecosystems, and that's SDG 15. Land use change for agriculture is one of the main sources of biodiversity loss worldwide. Now, as we've talked about in this podcast, we have this new methodology which could reverse this and complement SDG 2, that's regenerative agriculture. But it's multifactorial, and there's many things that you need to consider when looking at the SDG framework, and that as a solution for producing food.
Absolutely. And the other thing that really matters, and this is another reason why policy coherence is so important, is we've got to make sure that the changes we make are long lasting. You just have to hear what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment within the medical system to understand that if you don't deal with long-term problems, you could actually revert to the mean. The trouble is that most of the finance for the healthcare system came from foreign sources. And now that the Taliban has taken back control, the hospitals have got no money.
It's terrible. It might sound stupid to even mention it, but the idea is also to ensure that different institutions and policies aren't actually working against each other. With increasing global interconnectedness, decisions in one country can impact other countries. If you're subsidizing fossil fuels while promoting renewable energy, you may think you're hedging your bets, but you're actually undercutting that shift to a low carbon future. For example, support measures for fossil fuels amounting to $510 billion worldwide in 2014 can have implications everywhere. They have economic costs by distorting trade and competitiveness, environmental costs through overuse of resources, and of course, carbon emissions that overspill globally. Redistribution and healthcare impacts affect livelihoods. Air pollution kills more than 3 million people across the world every year.
So overall, the idea is to ensure that every action taken under one SDG strengthens or promotes another. So the 2030 agenda says that all of the goals should be integrated and are indivisible. And what they've got to do is balance the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable developments. And what that means is that everything needs to be understood as part of a whole.
No one can any longer doubt that economic growth by itself does not ensure social justice and inclusion for all, and isn't a sufficient goal in and of itself when it results in a breakdown of society. That means that we need justice and inclusion, meaning equal access to societal activity and decision-making through education and equality. Participatory decision-making contributes to more cohesive societies, human capital development, and economic growth, and helps to ensure that different voices are heard. Not everyone knows what the right decisions are, but ignoring the voices involved just doesn't work, whether you agree with them or not.
There's no question that things are going to be hard. Ending poverty is going to be more challenging on a planet facing natural resource degradation, resource scarcity, and climate change. That means that what we've got to do is break out of institution and policy silos to really fully realise the benefit of working together. We need to be able to identify the unintended consequences, those negative consequences of policies, and actually effectively manage the trade-offs that may be unavoidable across the SDGs, but we need to understand what they are in order to prioritise them. And it also means that this can't just be something that happens at an international level or a national level. It's got to be aligned across all of the levels, including regional and local.
Yeah, climate change is a great example of this. Like other systemic risks, it needs to be addressed globally through international collective action, but also requires aligning efforts at a national or subnational level in terms of legislative changes in economic, fiscal, trade, and energy policies. And at the local level, in terms of more specific details on land use, human settlement patterns, infrastructure, and transport planning.
Yeah, and this is the thing, that most underlying policies and even investments, certainly public ones, are a shared responsibility across different types of government. I think it's been estimated that 65% of the targets won't be reached without proper engagement with and coordination of local and subnational governments. Within the OECD, for example, subnational governments are responsible for nearly 60% of total public investment. And I think that's around 40% worldwide. And that means responsibility for investments in education, health, social infrastructure, water, sanitation, waste management, transport and housing.
Governments and many stakeholders tend to operate in sectoral silos, resulting in fragmented government action, and ultimately also in other institutions such as parliaments, international organisations and agencies, and civil society organisations. Experiments show that policy coherence does not happen automatically. It's a political choice by governments.
And if we're going to make it work, it's going to require deliberate interventions to ensure that there are coordinated institutional structures, that there are connected processes, that the right information is shared, as well as effective working methods and a collaborative administrative culture that takes into account the sectoral interconnections and their effects for the achievement of the SDGs. I think it's worth noting in the UK, I think in the last 2 days, we've had a situation where a government minister has come out and completely contradicted a recently published working paper by the government because different departments don't seem to listen to each other.
Yeah, and it just isn't effective at every level. Key predictions for policy coherence include ensuring political will can make it happen, then investing in building capacity to do it right, and then providing the incentives to all actors to act now.
And again, it's a bit like trade. Political will doesn't happen in a vacuum. Politicians feel they need to feel they have support. Investing in building capacity means people need to understand what it is as well as how it works.
And basically, we're running out of time. We've got to think about time, distance, and most important of all, collaboration. There's lots and lots of details of how partnerships can work, but it's actually wider than SDG 17 itself.
Exactly. The SDG call for action on partnerships is for country action, but it calls on all of us too. This is an approach that's going to have to spread out across groups from Extinction Rebellion to the Tory party. We've got to find common ground on which to stand. We have a common goal, but we need to express it in a way so that we can all work towards what's needed while listening to all the voices affected by it.
And we appreciate in that sentence, it's bloody difficult to get everyone to hone together. But basically, this is the planet that we all live on. There's no other planet to go to. Either we get our shit in line and our ducks in a row and shift to this new way, or it's going to be a pretty miserable existence.
Yeah, exactly. So that means we've got a few little guidelines for what we think we can do. The first one is get involved, shape and share the political debate, be part of what's going on.
It means cross boundaries, find out what you don't know, ask questions and share what you know, as well as be positive.
And it means use your influence. It doesn't matter whether that's in politics, in your business, as a voter, an investor, or as a consumer. While it's not fair to put responsibility for a system problem onto individuals, we can still, as individuals, make people listen to what we care about.
Absolutely. That's part of the reason why we did this podcast. And to think about the grassroots, think about your community that you live in, whatever way you choose, but come together, build a better way forward.
So there you have it. That's one of our usual canters through a rather complicated goal, a little bit longer than usual, I feel, but thank you for listening.
That, guys, is actually our last SDG, and that brings to close our first season of Sustainable AF. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will be back.